Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read out Poisoner in Chief. Still in a chapter called I Feel Victimized. As soon as Gottlieb learned that he was being summoned to Washington for a second round of testimony before congressional inquisitors called Terry Lensinger, Lensinger recommended that they dust off the plan that they had worked before them. 3 days before Gottlieb was scheduled to testify, Senator Kennedy, who was to preside, abruptly postponed the hearing. Gottlieb had sent him an ultimatum: no testimony without immunity from prosecution. Because the drug testing programs involved were carried out between 1950 and 1973, most of what took place is beyond the scope of the 5-year statute of limitations for prosecuting federal crimes, the New York Times reported. Terry Lensinger, Mr. Gottlieb's lawyer, could not be reached for comment on his reasons for demanding immunity, but one source familiar with Mr. Gottlieb's activities said that the 5-year limitation does not apply to some criminal cases where a conspiracy exists. Kennedy faced a choice. He had accepted Gottlieb's demands for immunity. He might hear valuable testimony. That would also, however, make any future prosecution of Gottlieb difficult or impossible. While Senate lawyers were weighing their options, investigators found a trove of MKUltra tidbits in an unexpected place. The widow of George Hunter White, who had died 2 years earlier, had dominated his papers to Foothill Junior College south of San Francisco. Among them was White's diary. Entries provided raw new materials, not only Operation Midnight Climax, but also the roles that Gottlieb and Lashbrook had played in directing it. White excesses had undone him. In 1963, the year MKUltra drew to a close, doctors diagnosed him with cirrhosis of the liver. He was 57 years old. He, once imitating frame, had shrunk to 135 pounds. For a time, he served as the fire marshal of Stinton Beach, California, where, according to one researcher, he continued to drink and surround himself with adoring deviants until his death in 1975. Toward the end, he wrote a letter to Gottlieb thanking him for the chances to serve the United States while feeding his own appetites. His words are a unique tribute to MKUltra. I have very minor missionaries, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun. White wrote, there would also could be a red-blooded American boy, lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanctions and blessings of the All-Highest. Pretty good stuff, brother. Soon we were already intrigued by the mass of MKUltra documents that the CIA had found in response to John Mark's FOIA request. White's diary added more details. Kennedy decided that the best way to find out more about MKUltra would be to accept Gottlieb's demands as he'd be immunized from prosecution. Later, Lerner, when pressed for another concession, I insisted that the hearing be held in executive session behind closed doors and the witnesses be protected from exposure to the press and public, he wrote in his memoir. I told them that Gottlieb had the heart condition and a crowd of spectators that would be too much for him. Sid's cardiologist helped us out with a note warning against overexcitement. Most important, I said, for the safety of his family, it was imperative that Gottlieb's name not be leaked, nor a picture of him taken. When Gottlieb appeared before the Church Committee in 1975, senators knew nothing about MKUltra. By 1977, they had learned a bit more. Anticipation grew as it became clear that Gottlieb would soon appear and speak. On September 20th, he marked the first public appearance of the distinguished-looking scientist since he left the CIA in 1973. The New York Times published a man in the news profile. Sidney Gottlieb had been found, the Times reported, and he does indeed know the details of the drug experiments which were part of the CIA program called MKUltra. that was under his direction, and he will have a chance to say so tomorrow when the Kennedy subcommittee convenes to hear him testify. The Times profile describes Gottlieb as a biochemist who had spent years running the Technical Services Division, the gadget shop where wristwatch radios, exploding tie chips, and poison darts, the hardware of the trade, are produced. It said that during the years of the CIA, his official biography had listed him as a consultant to the Defense Department. Most intriguingly, it quoted several of Gottlieb's former associates. One remembers that he always followed orders, never made a decision on his own, and was not a guy who would make waves with authority. Another said, Sid's an honest man, but he's a tinkerer. He likes to fiddle with things. The last line was wounding. One former CIA official went further, saying that in his opinion, Dr. Gottlieb, who he described as a scientist who seemed failed to see the efforts in his work in human terms, should never have been permitted to run the division. Almost every man in the news profile that ran in the Times was accompanied by a photograph. Gottlieb's was not. The text explained that no image of him was known to exist. On the day the profile was published, Gottlieb arrived as scheduled to testify before the Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research. He slipped into a closed room. Waiting reporters clamored in vain. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, a key but shadowy figure in the Central Intelligence Agency secret drug testing program, told his story to the Senate subcommittee today, but he managed to elude the lights and microphones and the crush of reporters waiting for him in the Senate hearing room. The Times reported. Dr. Gottlieb asked for privacy on the ground that his health prohibited his testifying before a crowd. He got his wish. Only his voice, occasionally seemed to break with tension or with anger, came out of loudspeaker from a closed chamber next door where he was questioned. Gottlieb spoke for most of the morning. He began with a few sentences about MKUltra, which he said was a CIA project of utmost urgency. He aimed to investigate how it was possible to modify an individual's behavior by covert means. Then, without admitting to his specific abuse or even mentioning that he had directed MKUltra, he said he was pained by what he had done. I would like this committee to know that I considered all this work at the time it was done and in the context of circumstances that were extant in the period, so be extremely unpleasant, extremely difficult, extremely sensitive, and above all, to be very urgent and important. I realized that it was difficult to reconstruct those times in an atmosphere today, in this room. The feeling that we have that there was a real possibility that potential enemies, whose enemies would be showing specific aggression, intentions of that time, possessed capabilities in this field that we knew nothing about, and the possession of these capabilities, possible possession combined with their own ignorance about it, seemed to us to pose a threat to the magnitude of national survival. Gottlieb became reflective at one point in his testimony when Senator Kennedy asked him if Frank Olson's death gave him any cause to rethink the testing program. That was a traumatic period as far as I am concerned, Gottlieb replied. It was a great tragedy. It caused me a lot of personal anguish. I considered resigning from the CIA and going into other work because it affected us that way. Our final conclusion was to go ahead with the work on the basis that the best advice we could get medically was that the causal connection between LSD and the actual suicide was not absolute at all. The decision was, don't change anything, asked Senator John Chaffee of Rhode Island. Well, Gottlieb replied, the best I can respond to is that seems to be the case. During this hearing, Gottlieb was publicly asserted that conclusions he had reported to the CIA superiors when he ended MKUltra more than a decade earlier, there is no such thing as mind control. Painstaking research, Gottlieb told the subcommittee, had taught him that the effect of drug on human beings is very variable, unpredictable, and that neither drug nor other tools could be used to finely tune alter to another behavior. The conclusion from all the activities he said was that it was very difficult to predictably manipulate human behavior in any way. We're going to end here and we're going to continue to another day because this is going to go on between the brother of the President of the United States. You don't think this ties him to MK Ultra or his unaliving or Cielo Drive, huh? Well, if you think there's no truth there, then don't watch my stream. Have a nice day.